Today we're going to do something extremely unfair. We are going to be a bunch of Jews talking about the Palestinian story in a very self-validating way. We are going to try, and I am going to try and convince you that there are themes in the Palestinian story as told by Palestinians to Palestinians that are recurring and that we are living through right now, and that are the lens through which they're interpreting their current situation, and that are convincing and deep and serious, and we have to understand, or we won't understand them. They are not extremist, and they are not radical, and they are not wrong, and they are not any of these simplistic categories. They are people with clear and thoughtful and deep stories and experiences, and they are living out those stories and experiences just as are we ourselves. So, I'm going to first of all argue that they have a convincing story. There is no such person alive who does not have a convincing story. And if you don't understand how someone could possibly think what they think, not that they're not wrong, not that they're not catastrophically wrong, but that they're not stupid. If you don't understand why the other side isn't stupid, you haven't done your homework. Okay? We're approaching this from that premise. And now I'm going to try and lay out for you roughly 3 themes that recur in Palestinian history. We are not going to talk about last week. We are not going to talk about October 7th, maybe in the end 3 sentences. We are not even going to talk about the peace process of the 90s, which we talked about at great length while you were trying to nap on a bus. We are going to talk about the Ottoman Empire. And we're going to talk about the British Empire. And we're going to talk about how the archetypes through which Palestinians begin to think about us at a serious and systemic way, how they were developed, why it makes sense to think of us as colonialists and imperialists and all those other ists that they think of us as, okay? My goal for today is to convince you that it is smart, it is deep, it is sharp. At the end, I'm also going to try and explain to you what I have already basically explained to you. We discussed a little bit about Algeria and how they used, the PLO used the model of Algeria in the 60s to launch a strategy of terrorism. And there's a specific reason why it doesn't work on us. And there's a reason why Palestinian political elites don't wake up to the fact that it doesn't work on us. Not because, again, they are dumb, but because there is a tremendous cost to waking up from that strategy and from that theory of us. And so we're going to walk through it, but we're not going to walk through it as, oh, hey, look, Algeria worked, and they're going to try and do Algeria here, and why didn't it work? Because we have nowhere to go. That is an amazing thing that you now know. It is also the 3rd grade version of the story. And now we're going into the 7th grade version of the story. You ready? And if you want the whatever your age is version of the story, you're going to have to go to a library and read books. Sorry. I don't enjoy it any more than you do. Here we go. I want to start our story of the Palestinian interpretation. I am going to constantly refer to the story we told last Thursday of the Jewish experience. What happens in 1881? Why does 1881 begin the Jewish 20th century? It's a little early to begin the 20th century, but that's where it begins for the Jews. Yes? 1882 is the May Laws. The assassination is in 81. And why does that begin the Jewish story? The May Laws are a slight intensification of basically the rules of the Pale established by Catherine the Great, who for the Jews was not all that great. Why is that the beginning of the Jewish 20th century? Yes? It's the beginning of a wave of 1,200 pogroms over 40 years that does what to the Jews? Yes. It sends millions of Jews migrating. Mostly to? Yes. Yes. They're you. Most of them. That's who you are. Hello? You? Meet you? That's you. A tiny percentage of them migrate to this very unexpected place because they're just crazy people and deeply unserious people. And so they go where? Yes?
They go to Palestine.
Yes. They go to land that the Jews are calling in English Palestine. The Ottomans think of as a couple of different districts. They go to the land of Israel, what the Jews perceive as the land of Israel, which in Ottoman terms is a couple different areas. In Muslim history is a couple of different kinds of jurisdictions and lands as they understand the geography, but which quickly, essentially through Palestinian Christians, who of course have the same sense of the land of Israel as the Jews on account of how they have the same Bible, more or less, becomes almost identical over the course of really, until World War I, becomes almost identical to the Jewish idea of the land of Israel. And so a Palestinian national identity coalesces. And this is something Palestinian intellectuals say. This is not the Zionist version of the story. Palestinian national identity, in the same way the German identity coalesced at some point around certain events. Palestinian national identity coalesces in the terms that it uses today and understands itself today around this Jewish migration. But this Jewish migration in those first 40 years, between 1881 and 1921 roughly, is a trickle. It's 1,000 a year on average. It's something very, very small. They are very ideological, many of them. Incidentally, there's a very interesting book by a professor at Haifa University, Gur al-Ro'i, who actually argues that even they weren't Zionists. In other words, one of the fascinating points of Zionist history is the extent to which the aliyot, the great immigration waves of Jews, were not ideological. Palestinians don't know this, that we're refugees, because right? They think we are an ideological movement that got up and came over here as an act of will rather than an act of running away. One of the main reasons Palestinians don't know that we are refugees and not an active, conscious ideological movement is that, anybody want to take a guess and be really impressive? Why do Palestinians not know that in fact we are not a conscious decision, but mostly, demographically, refugees? Yes?
We don't know.
What do you mean we don't know?
When we tell the story of the Aliyah, we make it seem very ideological.
We don't tell that story. What do I mean we? Not you. Israelis in their schools. What story do they learn? They start with an organization called Bilu, Beit Israel Lechu V'Nelcha. The house of Israel, arise and walk. Bilu is the beginning of essentially socialist, various versions of socialist/communist Zionism in 1882 or 81. Bilu is 14 people. They get on a boat they go from, where were they? Kharkov, I think? And they leave Kharkov, they get to Istanbul port, and they get on a boat, and they go to Jaffa. And the Zionist story in Israeli school textbooks begins there with them. And it then follows the kibbutz story, the story of the little agrarian settlements, which is an ideological story because these were people building communes to create a new Jew. They were also a tiny percentage of the actual immigration. And so because we focus, it's a little bit like Americans focusing on the Pilgrims. The vast majority of early America is the commercial centers of Virginia. But the Pilgrims created a lot of the sort of cultural essence of America, the radical individualism, that radical Protestantism, a lot of those ideas that became the American idea, even though they were demographically a very small part of America. So the kibbutz movement, the early ideological Palestinians, if they listen to us, will have trouble noticing that Zionism is primarily, demographically, a rescue operation of millions of refugees. Okay? That's the story we know. As they begin trickling in, as they begin trickling through Istanbul port, or it's not yet called Istanbul, it's still called Constantinople. As they begin trickling through Constantinople and getting on boats to Jaffa, Jews are lining up at the Ottoman consulate in Odessa to get passports, to get permits to travel through Ottoman lands. And in April of 1882, in springtime in Odessa, a sign is put up at the consulate. Literally a sign. Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire will be able to settle as scattered groups throughout the Ottoman Empire excluding Palestine. The Ottoman government establishes very, very quickly. I don't think 1,000 Jews have yet moved to Ottoman Palestine. And the Ottoman government puts up a sign and says, please don't come here. You want to come to the Ottoman Empire? You want to be subjects of the Ottoman Empire? Go for it, enjoy. Everybody settles somewhere else. There's no concentration of Jews in the Ottoman Empire. Why would the Ottoman Empire not want a concentration of Jews somewhere?
Because it's pretty dangerous to give people a land that they've been praying for thousands of years.
You're going to have to explain that.
If someone has such a kinship to the land, they're obviously making a claim to it. If they're just going from Russia to, I don't know, somewhere to Syria, then why would it doesn't really matter politically.
It's along that vein. Anybody else? Yes.
This way they'll be spread out throughout the whole Ottoman Empire.
And?
Otherwise we would hold them to the same place, and that would be a threat to the security.
Why would we be a threat? Yes, over back in there.
We have our own sort of nation already and have like dual loyalty.
What are they afraid of?
They're afraid of Jewish separatism.
What is a 400-year-old empire at the beginning of the end of the 19th century afraid of? What are all the empires toward the end of the 19th century afraid of? What? Nationalism. The Jews can come. You're welcome. You know what you can't do? You can't be a nation. Because we have a lot of nations. We're done with nations. Incidentally, at some point, about 15 years later, they're going to meet with the top of the Zionist movement is going to meet with the top official. And the top official is going to say, we can't have you take the land away from Islam. But you know what land we could have you concentrate in if you really want? Greece. Greece is super empty right now. You guys want Greece? Why would the Ottoman Empire roughly, I think it's 1905, I can look it up, have a meeting with Zionist leaders and say, why don't you all go to Greece? Because what's happening in Greece? Yes? There is a beginning of a nationalism. And how do you prevent a nationalism? You mix everybody up. The old empires were ethnically mixed. Not just they were ethnically mixed because everyone loved each other and lived together in harmony. They were ethnically mixed to prevent a nationalist threat to the empire as a whole. And so the Ottomans begin at the very beginning. There's almost no Jews coming, but they are reading. There's actually evidence, letters by Ottoman diplomats in Vienna, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who we know were reading Zionist tracts and Zionist writings from the Russian Empire. And they're starting to worry about this new Jewish nationalism because down the road, you nip nationalism in the bud because once it gets going, it's awfully hard to stop. The Ottoman Empire knows that it's weak. It knows that it is, I don't know if knows, but not long for this world. We're going to hear that. We're going to hear that in a second. The Sultan himself is going to tell us that. And it is very worried about nationalisms. Yes?
Wait, sorry, I don't want to...
You don't have to.
I guess, wait, wasn't Greece independent after 1821? So how would the Ottomans have been able to make...
Yeah, it was specifically, I believe, in Thrace. It was specifically in, or it was
So like,
Saloniki.
yeah.
Yes, but they were worried deeply about the challenge of Greek independence. And it's not just that. All through the Iberian Peninsula / what is today the Balkans. If you're in 1882 when that sign is put up, 4 years ago, in 1878, the Russian Empire took Bulgaria from you, which is a very big place at the time. And so there are these wars, and there's this, and the Russians used Bulgarian nationalism in that area. And so, yes, it's not that in Greece there begins to be, but there is this challenge of Greek nationalism, and the Greek-speaking parts of the empire, which, by the way, at the time include Western Anatolia, what is today Turkey. The more you dilute, the more you dilute the concentrations of ethnic Greeks, the more your problem is solved. But yes, so why is this important? This is important because at the very beginning of the Ottoman Empire, of the Aliyah, as we understand the Aliyah, the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, at the very beginning, the Arab elites of Jerusalem, the Arab elites of Jaffa, they think of themselves, they know themselves to be Ottoman elites. They are the Ottoman officials who run these places. And they are the essentially important families who traditionally inherit the main positions in these cities and in this region and in this land. And when the Jewish trickle starts coming in, the very first response is not, oh no, Zionism is going to take the land of Palestine away from the Palestinians. What's the first response? The first response is, oh no, the Jews are. We mentioned this. What are the Jews? The first aliyot, as they come through Jaffa, why are the Jews worrying to the people running the port in Jaffa, to the city council of Jerusalem? Why are the Jews a worrying prospect? Because they are?
They're becoming a nation.
What?
They're becoming a nation.
No. 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 Sure, but no. The Jews are Russians. The first problem that Arabs have with Jews in this land is that they are Russians. Why, if you are an Ottoman elite, the local Ottoman elite, the local imperial elite, the Ottoman Empire has ruled this place for 400 years. Why are you worried that the Jews are Russian? And they talk about it. They talk about the Jews being Russians. Because if you are a Russian, and the arch enemy, the great enemy of the Russian Empire, of the Ottoman Empire, is Russia, the last land literally ceded in war by the Ottoman Empire was with Russia. Over the previous 80 years or so, the Ottoman Empire had fought 4 wars with Russia. Russia was encroaching. Russia had claims on holy sites in Jerusalem. Not only that, but there was something called the capitulations. The capitulations are a series of treaties that the Ottoman Empire signs, really over the preceding century, in other words, from early 18th century, maybe late 17th century, with Western empires, with Venice, with the Russian Empire, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They sign treaties that essentially give subjects of Western Christian empires immunity from Ottoman law and Ottoman courts. Why would the Ottoman Empire cede the right to literally try, to arrest and try for crimes of a citizen of Venice or a citizen of Vienna or a citizen of Moscow in Ottoman courts?
They're just too weak to sort of resist that sort of situation.
No. They're pretty weak, but that is a pretty big concession. Why would they do such a thing? Try to imagine why that might even happen. Yeah, you raised your hand. You didn't notice? Oh, you did that. Folks, commerce. The Ottoman Empire is desperately poor, and they want to get commerce into the empire. And one of the ways that they want Western commerce to come in through the empire and not to take sea routes around the empire, for example, is by ceding all kinds of concessions to commercial enterprises and traders of Western Christian empires. And so the Jews who arrive, what do they think they are? The Jews who land in 1887 at Jaffa Port, what do they think they are? Yeah. What do the Jews think they are? Why are they arriving? They are running the hell away from this horrifying empire and its pogroms. What do the Arab elites, who think of themselves still as Ottoman elites, see?
The Russians are coming to Russia.
A bunch of Russian subjects, not subject to their own law, showing up and establishing tiny little communes and evading the local justice and local police in any real way. It's not only that. There is, I want to get to, this is Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti, a man who supported Hitler in the Second World War, pretty famous for that. Don't support Hitler in the World War or you'll be famous for it. This is his father Kamil. His father Kamil was the Grand Mufti before him. His father Kamil was the Mufti in Ottoman times, and therefore he was also a member of the Jerusalem City Council. And in 1914, the Jerusalem City Council convenes at the governor's behest, the Ottoman governor, Mutasharrif, as you say in Turkish, if your Turkish is like mine, which is to say I know 3 words, all of them political positions in the empire. That is how you say it. Kamil al-Husseini sits on that city council as the Mufti of Jerusalem, as the great religious authority of Jerusalem, and he has a great idea, a great suggestion. And it is recorded in the minutes of the city council. And his suggestion is, why are the Jews coming? We know why they're coming. Yeah, they're Russian subjects, and that's terrible, and it's a disaster, but why are they coming? We all know about the Zionist congresses, right? Why are they coming? They're coming not because of the Zionist congresses, and they're not coming as agents of the Russian Empire. Why are they actually coming?
They have nowhere else to go.
They're refugees. He says the Romanians, roughly what is today Romania plus about half of the other countries, are tormenting them. And so they come here. So how do you get rid of them?
Torment them?
You torment them. And then what are they going to do? Keep going till they find the next place. What do you think of that? What does the Ottoman governor think of that? What? He's dancing between a lot of raindrops here. You can't start oppressing Russian subjects on Ottoman soil if you're the Ottoman Empire. Or you can, but that's a big thing to do. The Tsar wants the Jews out of the empire because he hates the Jews. But as soon as the Jews are here, the Tsar does try to protect them simply for imperial prestige. You can't have Russians stepped on, even if they're Jews who I hate. But once they're here, they're Russians, and you can't have them stepped on. And so in that world, there is the beginning of an understanding of why they're coming. It isn't that they don't know that something is happening, but this suggestion, these elites, they're still thinking essentially in Ottoman terms and trying to work through Ottoman institutions. What is the great experience of the Palestinians in this period? One of the things that Camille al-Husseini does in the 1910s is that he chairs a committee established by the government in Constantinople to look into the question of Jewish immigration. He is the chair of the committee, and he issues recommendations. And the recommendations are, we have to stop the Jewish immigration. And he issues these recommendations, and the Ottoman government does nothing. One of the big things that he also recommends stopping is Jewish land sales to Jews. And the Ottoman Empire does nothing. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire sends to Jerusalem a much more competent governor, a governor who understands that they're actually going to start having a problem with the Arabs if the Jews keep coming. Having a problem with the Arabs matters to the empire. Where the Jews settle doesn't. Not so much anymore. They failed to stop them from coming in after the original policy of 1882. And so he actually does crack down on land sales, and he also cracks down to Zionist organizations, and he also cracks down on immigration. The problem is that the governor in Jerusalem only oversees the little provincial pocket of Jerusalem, Jerusalem to Jaffa. If you go as far north as Nablus, or roughly the latitude today, I think, of Netanya, that's already a different province, run out of Beirut. Because the Ottomans didn't think of the word Palestine in the same way. And so when the Zionists can't buy land around Jerusalem, what do? The governor in Beirut is a lot less difficult to deal with, or more incompetent, or slightly more corrupt. And so they buy there. They buy land around Tiberias, which is part of Beirut. And then after a couple of years, the governor in Jerusalem is replaced. And this guy is no problem at all. So they come back to buying around Jerusalem. What does Camille al-Husseini see? Camille al-Husseini sees something that is at the foundation and cornerstone of Palestinian identity to this day. As he's watching this happen, what is he concluding? Guys, courage, speak, yes. Yes, you raised your hand, that's your problem that you don't have to speak, yes.
They're trying to take over.
Never mind the Zionists, he sees something more, deeper about the Islam, yes.
Abandonment.
Who's betraying him?
His own.
He gets that the Jews are running away, not all of them do, he does. There's a big problem that they're also subject to the very people who are kicking them out. So they get the protections, but also they're being kicked out to Palestine. That's a big problem. But he gets that he runs a committee. He is an Ottoman elite. And the Ottoman Empire can't get its shit together. Excuse me, that's going to be recorded. Can't get its anything together. This is the age of TikTok. I don't think I'm going to shock anyone. Do you feel the frustration? There is a theme that comes back for generations of abandonment by the Arab world, of abandonment by Islam. After October 7, Hamas officials at the Four Seasons in Qatar, in Doha, have gone on television all over the Arab world, and they've said what? Where is who? Where is Iran? Where's Hezbollah? Where's the Arab world? Where are the legions? Where are the Mujahideen marching on Palestine? In 1948, in 1967. Every day, every year throughout Palestinian existence, from the very beginning, with the very weakness of the Ottoman Empire, the story is a story of Islamic weakness and Arab weakness. Yes?
There are also the tanks that Egypt put on its border facing Gaza so that if Palestinians flee, then
The one thing the Arab world is very strong about is that they don't want the Palestinians with them. Yes?
Well, why was it in 48 and 67 they felt any about Arab groups, but not many Arab states joined or led the fight against Israel?
A lot less than could have, and a lot less, as they view it, than should have. In 1896, Herzl goes to Constantinople and he wants to meet the Sultan. And he has a friend, an aide, who sort of has friends in the court of the Sultan, and they have a conversation, and he tries to get in, and Abdul Hamid won't meet him. And he records in his diary what his aide, who did converse with either the Sultan himself or the Sultan's chief, tells him. And this is what the Sultan says, quoted by Herzl himself. If Mr. Herzl is as much your friend, you, Philippe Michael de Novlinsky, I'm not that good at 19th century Viennese German either. If Mr. Herzl is as much your friend as you are mine, advise him not to take another step in this matter being that I'm going to concede Palestine to the Zionists. I cannot sell even a foot of land, for it does not belong to me, but to my people. My people, the Ottomans. Maybe my people, the Muslims. He styled himself also the Caliph of Islam. My people have won this empire by fighting for it with their blood and have fertilized it with their blood. We will again cover it with our blood before we allow it to be wrested away from us. The men of 2 of my regiments from Syria and Palestine, let them themselves be killed one by one at Plevna against the Russians. Not one of them yielded. They all gave their lives on that battlefield. That's not entirely true of the battle itself, but it's not bad imperial propaganda. The Turkish Empire belongs not to me, but to the Turkish people. At the time, Turkish people means Ottoman. It's not an ethnic designation. I cannot give away any part of it. Let the Jews save their billions. He is overseeing an empire that's essentially bankrupt. And the Jewish financiers of Europe could potentially save it, and they're having negotiations over credit lines from Jewish families and Jewish banks. When my empire is partitioned, everybody paying attention? They may get Palestine for nothing, but only our corpse will be divided. I will not agree to vivisection. What does the emperor, the final, last, in 1908 he falls and he is the last, emperor know? What is that? 13 years before he actually falls in the Young Turk Revolution. Yes? He knows the Ottoman Empire, what it looks like. He knows that that's his weakness in the face of Zionism. The Jews can give him something he needs. He's so pathetically weak that Jewish money can matter to him. Jewish money can't change the fundamental policies of Germany. It can't change the fundamental policies of Britain. But the Ottoman Empire is so poor and so weak, it can change the fundamental policies of the Ottoman Empire. And he stands his ground and he says, no. Why no?
I just want to comment on the my people that won this empire. There is a continuation of the quote that he said Turkish people are implying that it's the people in Turkey who own the empire rather than...
He means, I have read that he means, not an expert on the last emperor, but he means the Ottomans. He means what we would call today Ottomans, which includes vast numbers of Arabs, vast numbers of Kurds, vast numbers, all the many multi-ethnicities that are plugged in to the power structures of the empire. So I don't think he's saying something ethnic. He falls to essentially a Turkish nationalist movement where Turkish means the ethnicity and not the imperial identity. But I think, speaking as a non-expert, I think he's referring to Ottomans, and therefore essentially kind of Muslims also. Even those vast, vast parts of the Muslim world outside his empire, he styles himself a caliph, the great leader of the Muslims. Yeah?
He doesn't believe he's a master of his politics. He thinks that he can't control it. People who fought for it, they're going to be unwilling to give it up. So even entertaining a conversation is ridiculous because it's impossible for people to accept it.
The people won't accept it, and it's not just that the people won't accept it.
There.
Better to fall than to live another day having given up. What? Herzl doesn't meet the Sultan because of this. Yeah. Yusuf Dia al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi. Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi was made famous by his, I believe, great-grandnephew, Rashid Khalidi, professor at Columbia University. He opens Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. And the quote that I'm about to show you opens that book. A letter to Herzl in 1899, responding to the First Zionist Congress. Khalidi is a part of the Jerusalem political elite, the Khalidis, the Husseinis, the Nashashibis. There's a handful, 5 or 6 families who are the elites, the Arab elites, certainly of Jerusalem, also of Jaffa. And they are essentially, first of all, they're Ottoman, in the sense that I believe Khalidi himself was an Ottoman diplomat in Bordeaux. They are people who feel deeply imperial. And also, they are the first people to be very worried about this Jewish immigration. In principle, he writes to Herzl, Zionism is natural, beautiful, and just. Who could contest the rights of the Jews in Palestine? It's the basic story. Everybody knows what the Jews are, right? My God, historically, it is your country. There's a big debate between Zionist historians and Palestinian historians over whether this is an admission. I don't really care if it's an admission. It's certainly the right thing to say to a Herzl if you're trying to convince him to change his mind, right? But the brutal force of circumstances had to be taken into account. Your rights are one thing. There's a problem with you coming here. What is that problem? Palestine is an integral part of the Ottoman Empire. This is the part that nobody cares about, but this is the part that I care about, because this is the part that fashions more of the Palestinian story than all the rest. What's the first problem? And what's the second problem? More gravely, it's inhabited by others. We live here. What are you going to do to us? Remember, Islam and displacement. We're going to talk about themes. In 1898, one of the great intellectuals of the period, Rashid Rida, he has a very long name, I don't remember it. He has a journal in Cairo, Al-Manar. He himself comes from Beirut. If you come from Beirut, that means that you also feel that you are partly part of the northern half of what is Palestine, right? Because the Galilee is Beirut in Ottoman terms. In 1898, he becomes his first response to Zionism is positive, and then very, very quickly it turns very negative. 1898 is a year after the First Zionist Congress, which he followed carefully and read the Zionists and thought about the Zionists. And he becomes one of the great intellectual figures. He also is the teacher of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the son of Camille, who we will meet shortly. And he writes in Al-Manar to the Arabs of Palestine. And he writes extremely politely, "You complacent non-entities, are you content for it to be reported in the newspapers of every country that the penniless of the weakest of peoples," by which he means what college campuses today they call Zionists, "whom all governments are expelling, have so much knowledge and understanding of civilization and its ways that they can take possession of your country, establish colonies in it, and reduce its masters to hired laborers and its rich to poor men." What is his concern? Yes?
You're about to lose to the the weakest team in the league.
Yes, you're about to lose, but he's not that concerned about people losing. He does not write these letters about other places where Muslims are in retreat because of modern nationalisms or because the Russian Empire is expanding in the Balkans. What is his concern? Yes, and that is a question of honor and pride. And why is it even, what is his concern? Why is that even more painful? Because?
Losing a grip on empire and making the league.
Empire is something, but he, by the way, is an Islamic renewalist, we'll call it. In other words, he says, he starts to think very seriously in this period about how Islam comes back as a powerful force in history, as an agent of history. So I don't know if he's desperately concerned about the Ottoman Empire. He's, by the way, in Egypt, when Egypt is already controlled by Britain. Yes?
Forces the confrontation of the question of what to do with Islam weakness. It shows it around.
Islamic weakness, and how does that come out? What is he concerned with? Why is this painful? Yes?
I mean, this is the land, the Crusades, right? They were able to beat those back. Are you now going to...
Yes, but you guys are missing half the text. Yes?
Their reputation and legacy.
Yes, but what's the main half of the... Yes? Yes! Why should you be ashamed? Why should you be ashamed? The great British Empire is taken. He's living in British Egypt. He is ruled by a Western Christian empire. What's the pathetic problem to Palestine? Yes. The Jews! What's the problem with the Jews?
They're poor. They're weak.
Nobody wants
If the Jews can take us, where do you go from here? How much lower can you go? He's got a point. If the Jews of 1898 can take you, holy mackerel, you're pretty pathetic. You complacent nonentities. We are not right now doing a history of Palestinians or Palestine. We are going through a sort of hop, skip, and jump through some of these themes and ideas as Palestinians, as significant figures who develop these ideas start to talk about them. And that brings us to Haj Amin. Haj Amin is the son of Kamil, the son of the Mufti, made by the British the Grand Mufti when the British take over. Haj Amin inherits the title of Grand Mufti. Haj Amin also is the student of Rashid Rida. So he's already a little bit primed to think of the Palestine problem as a problem of, what's Rashid Rida's fundamental problem? The Jews and therefore Islamic honor. And Haj Amin's great problem is that the Arabs of Palestine don't understand that they are actually fighting a much larger fight, which is a fight for Islamic honor. It's hard to say liberation, because it really depends liberation from who? He is a very close collaborator with the British Empire. He was very happy under the Ottoman Empire, and is sad it fell, right? So he's not talking about nationalism in exactly that way. The problem is the Jews, but not simply the Jews. They aren't anti-Semites just for, by the way, that's what it feels like to the Jews, and that's how it should feel like to the Jews. But the Jews are a specific problem, and the problem is if we're losing to the Jews, that is how pathetic we are, that is how weak we are. And so he needs to awaken them. In 1920, he starts a riot, standing at Al-Aqsa Mosque, over the sanctity of Al-Aqsa Mosque, over the sanctity of Jerusalem, against the Jews. In 1929, he helps spark that riot, and it is again defined as a religious violence against the Jews for violating Al-Aqsa. He wants this to be what? The Jewish-Arab encounter in Palestine needs to become, in his view, holy war, or a war for Islamic dignity and honor and restoration. And Haj Amin really tracks that history of Imperial Britain and Zionism. In 1917, the British government issues the Balfour Declaration. If you are an Arab in Palestine, what does that feel like? The intellectual elites, what does that feel like?
It feels sad.
What does that feel sad for? Why is that sad? What happens in 1917 in Palestine?
Like you have this land,
Who are the British if you are a Palestinian Arab in 1917? They are the... What war is underway? World War I. And who's in control at the beginning of World War I? And who's in control at the end of World War I? And therefore 1917 is the year of the conquest. And so the British are the new. So this is a problem. Right? Why is this a problem? They're not just the new. They are so vastly more powerful than the pathetic Muslim empire that has been defeated, that itself could not stop Zionism from taking root. And then the Balfour Declaration comes like a thunderbolt. And in the face of the Balfour Declaration, it's not just the Balfour Declaration, it gets very complicated. There's the San Remo Conference in 1923, in which the Arab League gathers at San Remo and starts to talk about the Jews getting this land as the Jewish state, as the solution to the Jewish problem. Also in light of the Balfour Declaration, who is not invited to the San Remo Conference? Don't be scared to guess. What? The Palestinian Arab elites. And so the Western empires, the Jews begin their entry into the land as agents of who? The Tsar they're running away from. By 1917, the new conqueror declares with trumpets and flags that the Jewish national home, not a state, but a national home, what the heck is that? They won't say. Ambiguity is not in your favor if you're a Palestinian Arab right now and the British just conquered the place. At least you don't think so. The Jews, by the way, were also not so excited about the ambiguity. And then San Remo, you're not even invited. Things escalate. In 1921, what does America do? We talked about it on Thursday. Immigration quotas. In 1921, 20,000 Jews land in New York Harbor. By 1924, how many Jews land in New York Harbor? 10,000. And by 1934, that was the number I had up there? 2,700. And so America is closing its doors. The West is closing its doors. Where are the Jews starting to go in massive numbers? Until 1921, you thought you had a problem. In 1935 alone, 65,000 German-speaking Jews land in Palestine. Just in 1935. Now the problem really becomes a problem. Because hundreds of thousands are coming because they're running desperately away from a Europe that is literally becoming uninhabitable to them and where they are being slaughtered and kicked out of universities and being disenfranchised. Yes?
Who was the one who was organizing the San Remo conference that did the Palestinian elite?
I don't want to get into it, but Wikipedia is your friend. Seriously, look it up, read about it. It's fascinating, it's important. San Remo figures very big in right-wing Israeli Jewish discourse because that's when the League of Nations just said, it's all yours, you're done. And it also figures kind of big in Palestinian sort of advocacy discourse because that's where the West, as it colonialized, not colonized, colonialized, which is a little different, and imperialized, I'm using those as verbs now, just decided it can tell the Arabs what's happening to them, right? So it figures a bit. Read about it, go into it. Where was I? We have a massive outburst of violence in 1929, the first really major one. There was in 1920. In 1929, it's big. The massacre of the Jews of Hebron. And folks, we are headed into, and orchestrated, organized, also by Haj Amin, and now we are headed into a real clash. Palestinian elites are convinced by the 1930s that Zionism is the handmaiden of British imperialism. Are they convinced that Zionism is part of British imperialism because they're stupid and don't know that we're refugees? Yes.
Sorry, I just noticed that slowly we've been transitioning from Arab elites to Palestinian elites.
Hold on one second. The correct answer is no. Yes. As you were saying.
We haven't been doing that?
Sure.
So was there like a known shift in...
Roughly in 1910, they start talking about themselves as Palestinian elites. The world calls the land Palestine and the people Arab. Palestinians call the land Palestine and the people Arab. And then you suddenly, in 1914, have a newspaper in Jaffa called Palestine. And then they begin more and more to use the concept of Palestine. It's not an accident that the newspaper Palestine and the other major Palestinian nationalist newspaper of 1914, Al-Karmil in Haifa, it's not an accident that both of them are put out by Christian Arabs. And so it's, in other words, people who think of Palestine the way Jews think of Palestine, of the land of Israel. And so it begins, it percolates. By the 1930s, it's pretty common. By the 1960s, it's everybody, but it is very much, you don't have to call them Palestinians if you don't want to. It doesn't really change much. They're certainly not Jews, so they're someone else, right? So, yes?
So you mentioned Islamic honor previously. When did the discourse of Ummah and Muslim take place? Was it always there?
I mean, it's already in Rashid Rida. He already talks about, did I cut that part? Oh, okay, so continuing that quote, later in the paragraph that I cited and then cut in half, he says, and your ummah and your, he talks about ummah, he talks about watan, the homeland, and he also talks about ummah, the nation, by which Islam talks about itself as a nation, which using the word ummah, but it means not nationalism nation, but Islam as a nation, right? So he talks about it literally in that quote. It's always been there in the theory. I mean, I'm not enough of an expert to answer that question with any precision, but it's certainly there in Rashid Rida. And it's certainly there in Rashid Rida's teachers. So 150 years, at least, where that kind of discourse as a response to modern Western imperialism is absolutely there. It's rich, it exists, there's newspapers, there's journals talking about it in the Arab world.
How did you like the Holy War view of it? Was it not successful in the beginning and then arise later on, or
Meaning what?
the Ummah and Muslim fight for the land and
It coalesces among Arab Muslim intellectuals as a response to the rising imperialism of the Western states. In other words, Britain and France take Ottoman lands France is already in Algeria in 1830. Britain's already in Egypt in, I think, 1860 or something like that. And then the Sykes-Picot after the war. In 17, Britain's already in control of Palestine. In 23, Sykes-Picot splits what had been the promised Arab sort of nation state, the unified Arab state promised by the British to Faisal and others, is now split up between the British and French zones of control, which become Syria, Lebanon in the north, and Iraq, Jordan, Israel in the south, etc. As that expands, discourse about an ummah and a grand Islamic response becomes center stage in Arab intellectual life. By the way, it's one of the solutions to the great problem. Other solutions are Arab nationalism. Other solutions, there are many, many different discourses as a response to this massive infiltration of European imperialism. And then begins, folks, the Arab Revolt. The Arab Revolt is very much led by Haj Amin. But it's actually sparked by someone more interesting than Haj Amin, Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam. You might be familiar with the name Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam. It is the namesake of Hamas's military brigades and of their most famous rocket. Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam is a preacher in Haifa who begins to found what we today would call, I guess, jihadi resistance groups. Little ones. Groups of 15 guys in Qalqilia. Groups of, some tiny organization coming out of Haifa. And he begins to, and he's two interesting things. One, he comes from the lower classes. He's not part of these elite families. And that's important. Because if you're Palestinian, one of the recurring themes of Palestinian history is that these elite families, like the Ottoman imperial edifice that preceded them, what are they responsible for? What did they do? Not address the Jews. That's not if you're. But what if you're Palestinian? What do you think of the elite family, the Husseinis and the Nashashibis, and the all the others, the Khalidis? Yes. Their basic legacy is failure. Catastrophic failure. And Izzeddin al-Qassam is a preacher, and he preaches to these very pious communities, essentially of workers, of laborers, including construction workers, including port workers. And he preaches to them, and he says to them, the solution is not going to come from the elites. The solution is going to come from Islamic piety, and it's going to come from holy war, and it's going to come from specifically the kind of holy war in the 1930s that we would later come to call essentially anti-colonial terrorism. And he begins launching these terror attacks in 1936 that very quickly expand into massive violence. Jews are killed in Jaffa. The British, over the next 3 years, are going to rush troops to Palestine, and they're going to embark on a massive campaign to suppress this, what the Palestinians come to call the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39. The Great Arab Revolt of 36 to 39 at the leadership level is led by Haj Amin in different ways. The British then exile him, but it is sparked by this religious idea, and it is sparked by this religious framework. And over the course of 1936 to 39, the British suppress, sometimes brutally, the Palestinian uprising, and the British for the first time give permission, give support, give training sometimes to Jews to begin to found, to the Zionist movement and to the Yeshuv, to begin to found Jewish military organizations. The Jews enter 1936 without standing military organizations of any value, and they leave 1939 with standing military organizations that have a real training, real hierarchies, and real capabilities. The Great Arab Revolt is suppressed by the British, and the Jews emerge from it much, much more powerful. Their estimates, wonderful book on this by Oren Kessler, 1936, I think he called it, about this revolt, about the history of the revolt. You must read it. You don't have a choice not to read it. And I believe it's also an audiobook, so don't work hard. And one of the fascinating things is if you're a Palestinian and you're watching the events of the Great Revolt, what does it look like? Who actually suppressed you? The Jews? The Jews start basically disarmed. They end well armed. Who suppressed you and armed the Jews? The British. And the suppression was massive. Expelled and killed were probably 10% of the fighting age men of the Palestinian Arab society. 1936 to 39 was suppressed so powerfully by the British that by the time Palestinian society gets to 1948, its fighting capacity is much reduced. Its ability to have a proper fight while the Jews are arming and arming and arming and arming in that intervening decade is is much lower than it would have been. And who did that to you? The British. And so the Zionists are literally now armed. Zionist weapons are literally supplied and built and trained by the British Empire. Is Zionism the handmaiden of British imperialism? Why would you attack the British in 36 to 39 when they're still extremely powerful, a world-spanning empire, and capable of surging to your country 100,000 troops? Why would you attack the British? Because you think, what? That Zionism is ultimately an arm of British imperialism. Why? Because of San Remo. Why? Because of Balfour. And if you're the Jews, what are you watching the Palestinians do? Yeah. Why would you attack the British now? We don't want the British here, but don't attack them now. How much dumber can you get? Because when the British leave, we're still here. Don't spend all of your military power in a war on the British that can't work. We're still here. 36 to 39 is a massive Palestinian loss catastrophe. One of the reasons Palestinians don't really know about 36 to 39 is that it was a self-inflicted disaster, and it was a real disaster. Haj Amin actually kills some of the leaders of the other families, of the Nashashibis, who want to take a different strategy and a different path in 1937 during the uprising. And so it is a choice made by Palestinian society with an internal debate, and it is a catastrophe for Palestinians. And one of the interesting points that Oren Kessler makes, is that there aren't really all that many Palestinian history books that even talk about 36 to 39. Because then you'd have to face the self-made disaster, the self-made strategic blunder that may have already settled 48 back in 36. But it is bad enough for the British. The revolt is bad enough. It is expensive enough. It is difficult enough that in 1939, after suppressing the Palestinian Arab revolt, what does the British Empire do? Yes,
They passed the white paper.
the White Paper. And what does the White Paper do in 1939?
They placed a 120,000 cap on Jewish immigration.
It essentially seals Jewish immigration to a tiny trickle into the land of Israel, just in time in 1939 for a tiny little event that we call, folks, if you're a Jew, the White Paper is a catastrophe. But it's also an absolute validation of the basic premise. What's the premise? The world is uninhabitable to us. There is no other choice. And the British are our enemy just as much as anyone else. If you're a Palestinian, what does 1939 for about 10 minutes look like? A massive success. It looks like a massive success. Why does Haj Amin, over the course of World War II, side with the Nazis?
Getting rid of the problem.
What?
Getting rid of the problem.
They are enemies of the British.
For the same reason, the Rashid Ali regime rises in Baghdad. The Nazis are anti-British. That doesn't mean they're not anti-Semitic. The Haj Amin and Rashid Ali and all those guys, they're anti-Semitic, but the strategy is to be anti-British, and therefore you're pro-Nazi. So pro-Nazi that you will, in fact, in 1935, I think, the German embassy in Jerusalem is now a Nazi embassy, flying a Nazi flag over Jerusalem. And the elites, led by Haj Amin, invite the Nazi ambassador to an event at Nebi Musa, this holy site in the desert down by Jericho. And they have a whole conference with him. And they wine and dine the guy, and they express this support, beginning in the mid-30s. By the time World War II comes around and Haj Amin is in Berlin or training Muslim battalions in Croatia to serve in the Nazi war effort, by the time that's happening, he's already been on the Nazi side for years and years and years. And the Nazis also see Palestine's Jews as part of the problem. They actually establish an Einsatzgruppen in Egypt, called the Einsatzgruppe in Ägyptum, for some reason in Latin. And they have plans for the Jews of Palestine. And Rommel's push east in North Africa has plans for the Jews of Palestine. And Palestinian Arab leaders, including Haj Amin, are very excited about those plans. And then what happens? Who saves the Jews?
Well, they stopped them.
Who saves the Jews?
Jews, sort of.
Who saves the Jews from Rommel's push east? The Allies where? The British where? At El Alamein, in the Battle of El Alamein. Now the problem with the Battle of El Alamein for the Jews is that it doesn't quite fit the Zionist narrative. Because what if the Nazis had won and the British had been kicked out of Egypt and then the Nazis were just walking to Palestine? What would happen to the Jews? Would Zionism have saved the Jews? Who ended up saving the Zionist project after already turning its back on the Zionist project, funneling the Jews essentially into Auschwitz, and then saving Palestinian Jewry by stopping the Nazis in Egypt? Who ended up doing that? Imperial Britain. So how much do we teach our kids about the great battle of El Alamein, in which Imperial Britain saved the Zionist project that we're definitely sure was the only thing that saved Jews, despite Britain turning its back? Everybody, one second. Everybody with me? It's not a story we tell ourselves, and so it's hard to hear it from us if you're Palestinian. Yes?
I guess I'm still not understanding why the Arab revolt wouldn't play into, or maybe I'm not understanding the Palestinian narrative, why they wouldn't talk about it. Because it seems like if you want to say, well, what Israel is, and right, Zionism is sort of this colonial project, you'd show, like, this would be the perfect example to show how they're intertwined. why would you avoid like this sort of moment where you
Absolutely.
say, clearly the British are on the Arab
They
side,
absolutely,
they're on the Jewish side.
they absolutely use it to show the intertwining of Western imperial interests and Zionism. What they don't do is talk about any Palestinian decisions or actions, and they don't teach the event in general, because then you got to look at some of the Palestinian actions. There's literally Aaron went looking, and there's a professor at I think the Open University, Arab-Israeli professor, who quotes in the book saying there just aren't books in Arabic on the Great Revolt. We don't want to talk about it as a society, Palestinian society. Because so many of the decisions made were so catastrophic. And it also puts 1948 in a different light. It is more a Palestinian self-made catastrophe than it would otherwise have been. And so we just don't talk about it. Just like the Jews don't talk about El Alamein, or the Jews don't talk about the refugee experience. And so when I give that talk that I gave on Thursday to Israelis, 19-year-old Israelis in pre-military academies about to go into the army, who are the best of the best, coming from the best high schools and headed to the best universities, and along the way there's something like 50 pilots that I once taught this stuff in pre-military academies over the last 10 years. They don't know that either. They don't know the things you don't know, because it's not the simple Zionist story, and so it's hard to stick it into the curriculum. Yes?
Why isn't it the simple Zionist story? Isn't it the simple Zionist story that nobody cared about us until we had a Holocaust?
There is literally a debate of Israeli and Zionist sociologists. A guy named Leszczynski, Jewish, from the 1940s, who's a sociologist, and he's one of the great sociologists working on Jews and Jewish migration in the 1940s, and he writes extensively about this problem of why aren't the Jews coming to the land of Israel. It's very embarrassing that they're not coming to the land of Israel until they have no choice. And he's a Zionist, and the Zionists don't want to talk about it, but why didn't they? And he has these beautiful lines like, the large river of migration is people whose sole desire is to make money, and that's why all of these refugees are headed to America. But there is a pure, if narrow, but nevertheless pure stream of migration that has national honor and comes to the blah, 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 blah. So that's a problem. Kudos to him for noticing the problem, but it's a problem that is untalked about by the Zionists because it's supposed to be ideological and not refugees. And when they have somewhere else wealthier, higher GDP per capita, better prospects to go to, they take their families there. I don't know why we don't talk about it, and I suspect we don't talk about it because socialists ran Zionism for a long time. People very used to ideological explanations and constructs for every single thing in history ran Zionist ideas and institutions for a very long time. But that's Herzl. Herzl is worried about a catastrophe. Herzl's idealizing of the Zionist enterprise and the Jewish state that is to come is very secondary. There's going to be an opera in the new Jewish state, but that's not really the point. The point is rescue. The point is catastrophe. I showed you guys the quote, what he told the Rothschilds on Thursday. The point is rescue. And so it's not Zionism. It is Zionism. That is absolutely Zionism. It's rescue. Rescuing the Jews is the big thing we did. Everything else was, but tell that to a 1940s socialist. I actually have this wonderful little letter from Tebenkin to Yigal Allon, this intellectual of the Mapam movement, the more communist of the socialist movements in the early years of the state, to Yigal Allon, the great general and the minister from Mapam. In 1960, I think, he went shopping on Fifth Avenue in America, and he comes back to Israel, and he writes a letter to Yigal Allon, and it's something like, it's in the biography of Yigal Allon by Anita Shapira, and in this letter he writes, I'm not so sure capitalism is collapsing. I just have to tell you, I know we know it is, I know it's guaranteed to be, I'm just not so sure it is, right? And it's like, it's an astonishing letter, but anyway, so there's this ideological, there's this addiction to ideological constructs. Incidentally, American universities are addicted to ideological constructs. One of the reasons you don't know your own damn story is that the only thing anyone ever teaches American young people is ideological constructs. Teach the ordinary social history of the Jews and you will learn a lot more about who you are. You'll learn a lot more about Zionism. You can't move millions of people, except by force, with ideological constructs.
What was
I don't know. I want to say Leicester, but that's definitely not it. I'll find it. Email me and I'll find it for you. It's in Gur al-Rui's book. He mocks him, which isn't fair because he was doing his best. And now we come to 1948. Before we come to 1948, my time is up. I have 17 minutes and I'm not even in 1948. Themes: Islamic betrayal, Arab betrayal. Not betrayal in the direct sense, not literally betraying me, selling me out, but just weakness. That's function. This is a theme of Palestinian history at every turn. Arab weakness, Muslim weakness, and the desperate desire to be redeemed from that weakness. That's what drove Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. That's what makes Izz ad-Din al-Qassam an extremely minor figure who didn't live very long and had no successes, the Hamas hero, because it was an Islamic story. He came and he said Islamic honor is the heart of the story. And he taught an Islamic piety that will be our redemption. Islamic weakness from Rashid Rida through Haj Amin, through Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, is at the heart of the Palestinian story. It's a theme of how Palestinians think about us. Imperial patrons. I want to do imperial patrons as well. We saw how the fact that we were Russian in 1882 matters as much as the fact that we were Jews. Before there was a standing proper Zionist movement, being Russian was the fear factor toward us, because they're Ottomans. And so there's always an imperial patron. That imperial patron is replaced by Britain. Incidentally, there's an intervening period where it's replaced by Germany, when Jews start leaving Germany and coming here in some significant numbers in the 1920s. This is something I think we talked about on the podcast. There's a debate among the Jews. The Technion is being founded, the great Israeli Technical University in Haifa, and there's a big debate, 1920s, over whether or not it should teach in German or Hebrew. Now, why would you teach in Hebrew? Because Zionism. Why would you teach in German? Because you can't do science in Hebrew. In 1920, you cannot do quantum physics in Hebrew. Well, if you can't do quantum physics in Hebrew, you better teach in a language that you can do. And Palestinian newspapers, including Palestine in Jaffa, cover this debate among the Jews. And what's fascinating as they cover it is they think that it's a debate between Jewish Hebrew nationalism and the German imperial connection that these German-speaking elites of the new Yeshuv have. It's a debate about identity, which among the Jews it's not. It is in a different sense, because what can we do with Hebrew is what kind of new society we're building. In that sense, it's an identity debate. But it's not a debate between loyalty to Zionism and loyalty to the Germans. That is not what it is. But there's always an external patron. There's always an outside force. In 1948, that debate about the outside force reaches the British Parliament, Egyptian Parliament. As the Egyptians declare war in 1948, this is an account of an Egyptian politician who, you could find this in Alex Jacobson and Amnon Rubinstein's book, Israel and the Family of Nations, and he has all the sources. When in May 1948, Britain withdrew from Palestine and the first Arab-Israeli war broke out, one of the reasons that Nokrashi Pasha, the Prime Minister of Egypt, gave in Parliament when asking for a declaration of war from the Egyptian Parliament was that Israel was the vanguard of world communism. He cited the kibbutz movement to press his point. Both houses of Parliament voted for war against Israel, quote, in defense of Arab rights and against communist atheism and nihilism. Why would the Jews be the vanguard of communism? What a silly thing for Egypt to think. Yes? The kibbutz movement, why else? Well, I mean, a lot of Jewish communists, but why else? No, but I want to hear the Czechs. Yes?
The Russians voted to the state of Israel.
Yes, but why else? So did Chile. Why else? They're literally funding, they're arming the Jews. The main arms supplier at the beginning of 48 to the Jews is a direct order from Stalin through the Czech Republic, through Czechoslovakia, to arm the Jews. The Jews have a huge problem with armaments. And their main arms come from the Soviets at the beginning. What do the Soviets see in the Jews? Hopefully a vanguard of world communism. And without the communists, they couldn't have. And so when the Arabs talk, I'm not saying that this, yes, when the Arabs talk about us, there always has to be, and by Arabs I mean generally the Arab world, whenever they're in conflict with us, there always has to be a patron. By 1956, not very long after this, 8 years later, who's the major arming agent of the Egyptians? The Soviets. The Egyptians are being supplied by the Soviets with all the guns to destroy the Jews. But in 1948, the actual declaration of war is against the vanguard of communism, which would have surprised the Palestinians who are still convinced it's British imperialism. Remember Algeria? 1962, the FLN victory. 1964, the PLO. What's the theory behind the FLN victory?
You make the cost of being there too high. It's the acts of violence.
And then the Jews, once you terrorize them and the cost is too high, they leave. Where do they leave to? The Pale of Settlement in 1962? Where do they leave to? Whoever will take them, maybe? By 1964, when the PLO is founded on the FLN model, half the Jews of Israel are what? From? The Arab world. What's the great tragedy of the PLO founding itself on the model of the FLN? That as the French all leave, who else has to leave? If they'd noticed what happened to the Jews as the FLN come to power, they would have been less convinced, I think. But they don't notice what happens to Algeria's Jews when the FLN comes to power. So they're convinced that they don't notice that the story of the FLN and the Jewish flight in '62 from Algeria is the validation of the invalidation of the very strategy that they learned from the Algerian FLN experience, right? But part of the story that I didn't tell you with Algeria, and you will read in Alistair Horn, is 1956. In the '56 war, that is a war that Israel now sees itself in existential dread. It's, by the way, very similar to this moment strategically, which is a piece I'm now writing for the Times of Israel, so make sure to still read it and click on the ads. In 1956, the Jews, 8 years after 48, suddenly awakened to the fact that they are surrounded by a new Arab nationalism led by this guy named Nasser, supplied and funded by the British. In 48, the Arabs were essentially chaos, poorly armed, poorly trained, profoundly uncoordinated, could barely field armies of any value in the field. By 1956, that was no longer true. And so part of '56 was an attempt to push back this mortal threat that the Israelis suddenly see in this new Arab nationalism. But what did the Arabs see? Who helped the Israelis? Who asked the Israelis to conquer Sinai in what we call the Kadesh operation? The British and the French. And the French forces that arrive in Sinai don't get to fight. They have to turn right back around because of Eisenhower. But the French forces that arrive in the Sinai, where are they from? What? Algeria. Are you connecting the dots? Because if you're Arab in 1956, you can't not connect those dots. So what is Zionism? Okay, we thought it was communism. We thought it was, it's definitely now still British and French imperialism. Because now the communists are on our side. Because third world. 1962, when the FLN then drives the French out of Algeria, the connection is already so deep that it's what we say in Hebrew, mitbakesh. It's hard not to think that Algeria is Palestine. You'd have to make a conscious effort not to come to that conclusion because the connection is so consistent and so deep. And we are finishing up. I'm finishing intentionally in the 60s, and I'm going to now in 10 minutes rush through the rest of it. Okay, so I will talk longer. No, we're going to try and have a few questions. Yasser Arafat at the UN gives a speech in 1974, introduced by, that's by the way him at the Brandenburg Gate in like 1971. That's him with Soviet backing and support in East Germany. Yasser Arafat at the UN in 1974 is introduced to the podium of the General Assembly by The president of Algeria. Exactly. Who was also a leader of the FLN. And he's introduced to that podium and he says, read the speech, it's online, it's translated, read it. We live in a time of glorious change. An old world order is crumbling before our eyes as imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, that's the cool kind of colonialism from the Matrix, and racism, the chief form of which is Zionism. The important thing is that there's a lot of isms. Ineluctably perish. Good translator. We are privileged to be able to witness a great wave of history bearing peoples forward into a new world that they have created. He is wearing a gun. And he is talking about all the anti-colonial movements and the retreat of all the great Western empires. Of that, in that world, just causes will triumph. Of that, we are confident. The question of Palestine, sorry, apologies to Shalem College, belongs in this perspective of emergence and struggle. Palestine is crucial amongst those just causes, fought for unstintingly. Let's pretend I did that right. By masses laboring under imperialism and aggression. What is Zionism? I mean, all of them. Why? For all the reasons we learned. Is he an idiot? Is he a crazy person? He's a mass murderer, but is he an idiot? Yeah.
So he says this in France, he said before, a year after the Yom Kippur War. And
Yes. Yes. You know, sometimes gall and audacity are masking desperation. But I also think he believes this. And I don't just think he believes this. I think he believes his parents believed it. And I think he believes his grandparents believed it. And you know why? Because they did. And because it makes sense. Yeah. Yes, he's also 2 years after the Munich Olympic massacre. And he's, I think, just after or just before the Ma'alot massacre, when members of the DFLP came out of Lebanon, took over an Israeli school, and massacred 22 kids. So yes, he is the anti-colonialist, fighting the Algeria fight, coming to the UN and telling us we have 75 years of evidence that Zionism is imperialism, is colonialism, is neocolonialism, and is racism. This is also, of course, the Zionism is racism resolution. Right? It's happening right then. Okay? Everybody with me? Yes. All right. Zionism used imperialism, or empires, or whoever the heck was powerful in their day. Herzl tried to get into the Sultan. I don't know if you know, but the Ottoman Empire was imperial. List also, very much so. Folks, Zionism used it. But was it it? The Jews used the powers that be. Were they the powers that be? No. Why not? One good indication that should have given Palestinian intellectuals pause, but never did, was that the empire kept changing. If the empire keeps changing, the best example of that is the revolt against the British in 36 to 39 that leaves them much less ready to fight in 48, and the Jews are much more ready to fight in 48, and the Jews don't disappear when the British disappear. Because the whole theory of the Great Revolt is that if you get rid of the British, you get rid of the Jews. What if the Jews are using the British, as any small people will of the great empire of the day, rather than they are an actual arm of the British? What if the Jews were just taking the guns from the Czechs because there weren't other guns? Truman recognized Israel in 11 minutes, but Israel, for the entirety of the 48 war, is under an American arms embargo. I don't know if you heard that in your Zionism classes in American Hebrew school. So they take communist weapons. That's what they got. Are they Soviet? The Jews are not German imperialists. The Jews are not Russian imperialists. They're literal refugees from the Tsar, who the Tsar finds useful to make subjects when they're in the Ottoman Empire to try and curtail a little bit of power away from the Ottomans in any place he can. France, during the Algeria conflict, becomes deeply and closely connected to Israel. The French even signal to the Arabs that we are no different from the Zionists, which is not a great compliment to Zionism. But are they actually different from the Zionists? The French can leave and the Zionists never seem to manage to. And then in 1970, roughly, America becomes the great backer of Israel, for reasons having to do as much with geopolitics as love, because if it was love, it would have started earlier. And now the Palestinians are convinced to this very day that that imperial support is the only reason. I said to you, why doesn't it work? Why doesn't the anti-colonial struggle work against the Jews? It worked against so many others. And we all understood, because we're Jews and we're very smarmy and convinced we know everything, that obviously it didn't work because we have nowhere to go. But the Palestinians have an answer that doesn't require them to recognize that we have nowhere to go. What's their answer? There's always some empire or another backing them up, some patron or another backing them up. What is happening on your college campuses? The anti-Israel campaign on college campuses, the BDS movement, and every branch of it and everything that preceded it, flows. Some of its ideological underpinnings come from the Soviet period and Soviet propaganda and all that. That's all true. But that's not the main reason. It flows from Palestinian civil society. Palestinians started the BDS movement at Durban in 2001. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. And the Palestinian elites in the West guide this movement, give it its language, give it its strategy. And what is the strategy? Why obsessively campaign against Israel and Zionism in the West? Other than that you're bigots, which maybe you're bigots, but you don't have to be bigots. Why does it make sense? Yeah. Stay close. Stay inside the topic. You want to go far, and it is connected to everything. You want to weaken Israel? You, the resistance, weaken it from inside. We, the diaspora, we're going to take care of the great patron. There's always a great patron. And when we disconnect America from Israel, what happens to Israel? That's 100 years of history, we know that to be true. 100 years of evidence we know to be true. Time after time, it is literally our historical experience. There's always an empire. And then I would come to say to them, but it's always a different empire. Those clever Jews, maybe you're missing the weight of Jewish strength and resilience being internal to the Jews. But if the weight of Jewish strength and resilience is internal to the Jews, they have to actually talk to me, and they don't want to talk to me because of sunk costs. So they're going to find another empire, and they're going to detach us from it. And what if it works? Do we disappear? Do we evaporate? Do we no longer have a nuclear arsenal, allegedly according to foreign reports? What happens to us? Do we go back to Baghdad? It's the same basic problem. And it's at the heart of the internal Palestinian elite's discussion of us. Colonialism. I've told you about this footnote. It's time I tell you about the footnote. Remember the footnote? Yeah. By the Israeli geographer who's anti-Zionist and colonialist, anti-Zionism is colonialism, and he's anti-Zionist? And the footnote itself. I found it. You ready? Everybody emotionally ready? This is going to be wonderful. Alex Jacobson from the book I mentioned earlier put me onto this as well. Zionism is pure colonialism. Pure colonialism. With some differences. The differences are, this is a quote, Zionism's nature as an ethnic and national rather than economic project. Otherwise, it's totally colonialism. The refugee status of most of the Jews who came to Palestine. Otherwise, Zionism is colonialism. The loose organization of Jewish diaspora communities as opposed to well-organized colonial mother countries. Or if you're a college student, metropole. And lastly, the ideal of the return to Zion, single quotes, which is grounded in Jewish tradition. That is literally the footnote. Zionism is definitely colonialism, with the exception, I'm going to quote my great teacher, Alex Jacobson. In other words, Zionism was a colonialist phenomenon in all respects and fully resembled other examples of modern colonialism, apart from the fact that it was a national movement, that it was not motivated by desire for economic gain, that it arose out of Jewish suffering and was realized by people who may be defined as refugees, that the settlers had no colonial mother country, and that the bond with the land of Israel was part of the traditional historic identity of the Jewish people. Otherwise, it is totally colonialism. Why is this important? What does Zionism feel like to Palestinians? When Palestinians say, you're imperialist, you're colonialist, when Yasser Arafat gives this speech, this is a beautiful quote, I'm sorry, I have to say it. The Jewish national home came into existence at the point of British bayonets. It is definitely an imperialist project. I think that's Ilan Pape, by the way. I just love it so much, that quote, because it's so colorful, you know? Definitely, that is definitely what happened. And then the British turned on us and we still didn't disappear. Zionism's colonialism is important. It's an important part of this story. And it's an important and true and honest and earnest belief of Palestinian elites to this day. And it is what makes it's what makes it very hard to push forward into other kinds of engagement with us. Because in their experience, there were these three recurring themes at every step for a century. The three themes, folks, are the betrayal of the Arab and Islamic world. Israel and Palestine become, in this Islamic discourse, in this Arab discourse, and in this Palestinian discourse, the symbol of Islamic weakness, the symbol of Islamic retreat, the symbol of the failure of Islam to meet the modern age, which is why the Muslim world does not march for the genocide of Assad. And it does not speak out or cry or scream or shout for what happened in Yemen, 250,000 dead, mass starvation. At this very moment in Sudan, 1.5 million people are displaced. The Muslim world doesn't care. Because that's not telling a story about them. That's just telling a story about what's screwed up in Sudan. But the Israeli-Palestinian encounter for a century is a story about Islam and the weakness of Islam and the betrayal of Arab politics and the betrayal of that Islamic weakness and how pathetic it is to be on the retreat because the Jews are refugees. If they were to discover that the Jews are not in fact imperial agents of powerful Western empires, but pathetic refugees, which they secretly knew, as we saw from the father of the Mufti, then it's even worse. As Rashid Rida clarifies for us, better to be pushed back by a great empire than by the dregs of humanity, running away from pathetic pogromists. And so the story of Islamic renewal is the story of Israel-Palestine. That energy in the Muslim world, that energy in Islamic intellectual discourse, that energy in the Arab nationalist story, in pan-Arab nationalist story, and in the specific Palestinian nationalist story, is why Hamas is popular even when it's hated. It's why the Arab world is obsessed with us. It's why the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, can't stop talking about Israeli Jews who he's never met. Why would a Malaysian Prime Minister care about Israeli Jews? Because it's actually a vocabulary for talking about Islam and the place of Islam in history. And if you are sensitive to third world discourse, if you think of third world discourse as colonized versus colonizers, oppressed versus oppressor, that's why academia is obsessed with Israel. Even when it's inconvenient. Because you really should worry about all the dead people and all the things, your academia. But no, Israel is the big story because Israel is the symbol. Islam, the Muslim world's discourse about us, isn't just anti-Semitic. It's deep and it's powerful and it makes sense. And the Palestinians are still going to lose this thing because it's still diagnostically an incorrect understanding of us. It drives them to policies, to strategies that they are guaranteed to fail, to dislodge us, to remove us, until we have somewhere to go. One of my favorite points about those college campus kids screaming decolonization because they read 2 paragraphs out of Frantz Fanon in some class. What's adorable about them screaming decolonization, what are they actually trying to say? I don't think they're hurting me. By the way, I think they're hurting you. They know Israelis can't hear them. So it's about American Jews and detaching American Jews. It's anti-Semitism toward you. It has nothing to do with me because it literally can't affect me. But what are they actually screaming? What are they trying to, what kind of thinking are they trying to attach themselves to? They don't even understand that they're attaching themselves to all of these vast misdiagnoses of Palestinian history that have run through from the very beginning. I don't have time for any more. And the solution is Dr. King. Okay, questions? I don't have time, but I'm sorry, one sentence on Martin Luther King?
What?
Martin Luther King is the solution. That's the piece. You ready? We're going to solve the conflict, and it's going to take 3 minutes. Here we go. Dr. Martin Luther King was a very clever man. I didn't know that at first. When I was a high school student in Glendale, Wisconsin, I was forced by my AP American history teacher, little flex, to read about Dr. King. And I was very annoyed by Dr. King because he was speechifying and he was very sweet and very clever. And I'm the son of a rabbi, so I appreciated that he was a religious leader. But you guys are really making too much of the guy. I am a cynical know-it-all. And then I actually read Dr. King, and I fell madly in love with him. Not because he's a great spiritual leader. We got those a dime a dozen, and they're usually wrong. We in Israel, at least. I don't know about America. But because he was a phenomenal strategist. Dr. King marched in the South. And the marches in the South weren't going anywhere until he had an insight. He does not believe in nonviolence. He believes in something he called coercive nonviolence. He believes deeply and profoundly in the power of violence, just not his own, in the power of the other guy's violence. And so he went looking in the South for sheriffs, for police departments, for local governments who would respond to a march by Black American activists and their allies, including many Jews, with massive violence. He needed the violence. He went to Selma, and he went to Birmingham, and he went to places that he specifically sought out. Places where there would be a violent response. Where the sheriff, whether he was racist or not, and most were, it's 1950s America, in the South. But most sheriffs in the South thought that their main job was to keep the peace in the streets. You don't have to like the protesters, you have to keep the peace in the streets. But he needed the sheriffs who thought that their main job was to show the black man his place. He needed them. And he went to them. And they served their role beautifully. I hope he sent them flowers. And with the violence that he instigated on the other side through his nonviolence, he forced the story of justice onto the television screens of white America. Injustice is hard to see as a specific thing you can grab hold of. It's long, it's slow, you get used to it. So you need to make the injustice powerful and immediate and painful and unlook-awayable. New adjective. And you do that by the violence of the other side as a response to your nonviolence. And by doing that, King forced a conversation in white America because it became unpleasant, untenable, and therefore had to change. And then King went to the mall and he gave his I Have a Dream speech. And everybody remembers what line from I Have a Dream? My 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their Yes. And everybody remembers that part because it's adorable, because little kids are adorable. I have 4 little kids, and I hope they live in a world in which they will not be judged by the color of their skin, which is kind of beige, and by the... It's adorable, but that's not the heart of the speech. You know what the heart of the speech is? The check. Read the speech. Watch the speech. I have been given a promissory note by the founders of America, and I have gone to the Bank of Liberty and I have tried to cash it. He did it better. Just watch the original video. I refuse to believe that it came back marked insufficient funds. What's his point to America?
You owe us.
Not you owe us. Not just you. Why do you owe us? Yeah, you promised us, you promised you. What's his argument? His argument is, I don't need you to be something else. I need you to be you. If you were the you think you are, we'd be done here. If you were the you claim to be, you tell your kids you are, we're good. We have freedom and equality. I have come to the Bank of Liberty. Make sure my check can cash. Make sure there's enough liberty for the promise that you made to be kept. You slave-owning promisers of freedom. Make sure that that check can be cashed. Be who you claim to be. There are 2 kinds of conflict. There are 2 kinds of conflict. There are zero-sum conflicts. If I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. I had better win. There are such conflicts. I think the conflict with the Nazis is a zero-sum conflict. They exist. And then there's another kind of conflict. Let's call it a tragic conflict. The conflict where every side has justice. Every side has a point. Every side wants something they deserve. And in those kinds of conflicts, those conflicts are not really, they're not really a kind of conflict, they're a psychology of the leadership of the conflict. What do I mean by that? In a zero-sum conflict, if I am all justice and you are all evil, and I come to you, and I say, let's compromise with your evil. I'm all justice on my side. What happened when Chamberlain went to Munich? What happened to Chamberlain? What happens to a leader who goes to the other side that is all evil and wants to compromise with them? What happens to their own leadership? They are undermining themselves because the other side is absolute evil. You want me to compromise with absolute evil? What happens if the conflict is redefined not as a zero-sum conflict, but in fact as a conflict where the other side has a point? Obviously, 90% of the justice is on my side. I'm me. But there's 10% on the other side. What did King say about white America? By the way, in a debate, implicit and sometimes explicit, with Malcolm X. What did King say about white America? There's something over there I can negotiate with after 250 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow, after finally fighting the bloodiest war in their history over slavery. But yet there's something over there I can negotiate with. There is a justice over there I can reach out to. Their story of themselves. And if in a tragic conflict, in a conflict with multiple sources of justice, a leader who goes across and reaches out to the justice of the other side, makes the case for the justice of the other side, creates more justice. It's not zero-sum. There isn't exactly 40 units of justice, and if one has one, then the other loses one. You can have 20 units here, 20 units here, and you end up with 80 units altogether. You reach out to the other side of a conflict that is multiple sources of justice, and you say, I'm not making peace with your crimes. I'm not making peace with your horrors. I'm not making peace with your mistakes. But I can make peace with the rest of you, with your story of yourself that is about liberty. That's kind of strange, having a story, an identity about liberty. The American national identity being an idea of liberty. I can make peace with that. I can found a homeland in that. Take that model for 5 seconds and bring it into the Palestinian experience. Every single thing we have seen is about the Jews and the Arabs being in a zero-sum conflict. Everything the Jews get, the Palestinians lose. Everything the Palestinians get, the Jews lose. And it's nefarious, and it's foreign, and it can be wished away. With enough blood and gore and sacrifice, and it can be wished away. What if it can't be wished away? But not just if it can't be wished away. What if there's justice on the Jewish side? It doesn't have to be a lot of justice. just enough to hold on to. What if I accept on the Jewish side, not that Zionism is true, not that this is their homeland, it's my homeland, but that they're refugees with nowhere to go. There are people in this world need to breathe the air of this earth. Isn't that enough to hold on to? Can I make peace with that? The Palestinian political problem today, vis-a-vis peace, and we talked about the long arc of the Israeli experience of the peace process on the bus. Why Israelis think that they tried, and it collapsed in rivers of blood, time after time after time. Again, I'm not saying that's the entirety of the historical, objective historical truth, but that is deeply the Israeli Jewish experience. But what if, okay, if you are Hamas and you say, I'm in a zero-sum conflict, if I reach across the aisle, I will be undermined. What's the problem with the peacemakers of Palestine? What's the problem with Yasser Arafat when he went to Oslo? The Yasser Arafat of 1974, that speech, who then goes to Oslo, what's he making peace with? What's he making peace with?
Unjust enemy.
Colonialism and imperialism and racism and neocolonialism. He undermined himself. Why is Mahmoud Abbas profoundly hated? Because he's a dictator? Hamas are worse dictators. They're not hated. Why is Mahmoud Abbas hated? Because what? Because his own argument about himself is that he's Chamberlain. When the Palestinians learn our story, when they learn what you learned on Thursday, they don't lose this experience, but they see sifting through the clouds of that experience, the Jewish experience on the other side. And they learn the holes in their experience. That it doesn't invalidate what they went through. But there's more to the story. None of their story is a lie. None of their thinking is stupid. But there's just more. And when they learn that more, there's something to hold on to. And you don't have to be a Chamberlain to make that peace. And by the way, King was not polite. King was not gentle. There is a profoundly coercive, nonviolent Palestinian strategy. The Jews are founding settlements, found a bunch of settlements. What are the Jews going to do? Take you down from the mountaintops? Found more. What are they going to do now? Take you down again? Nobody shoots, nobody throws a punch. How quickly before the Israeli left is back? There is a Palestinian strategy, but it begins and ends with seeing the rest of the story, of their story, the rest of their story about us. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful time in Israel.